Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our third StrongPath series webinars on exercise as medicine. Today, we will discuss lifestyle for cancer prevention. We will be having a 30-minute webinar on the etiology of cancer, its lifestyle origins, lifestyle mechanisms of cancer prevention, as well as anti-cancerous effects of exercise, intermittent fasting, as well as occupational exposure that can increase your risk of cancer. Before we start, I will briefly explain the format for today. So Dr. Smith and Todd will be speaking on today's topic for approximately 20 to 25 minutes, and then we will open for the Q&A. To ask a question, please put your question in the Q&A chat, in which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And I will read the questions to Dr. Smith at the end. So I'll hand it over to Todd.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thanks everyone for joining. My name is Chief Todd LeDuc. I am a retired Assistant Fire Chief after 30 years of service from the Broward County, Florida Fire Service. I've also I'm on the Board of Directors for the International Association of Fire Chiefs and their Safety, Health, and Survival section, and currently am the Chief Strategy Officer for LifeScan Wellness Centers. They provide about 50,000 annual first responder occupational physicals throughout the country. So I'm glad to be with you today, and I'll let Dr. Smith introduce himself as well, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Chief. My background is obviously in academia. I teach future doctors. I run our undergraduate program in exercise physiology at the University of Miami, which as we switched it to a pre-med program, it grew from 10 students to 250. So we have a very popular pre-med program. I also founded our clinical and applied nutrition program, graduate program in nutrition that is, and teach nutrition at the medical school. I'm also the product development officer for StrongPath. And our commitment is to implement lifestyle strategies in prevention of disease. And obviously that's going to be a big topic today. So we're excited to talk to you.
Great, thanks, Dr. Smith. We're gonna start with really twofold, as Dr. Smith really just touched on. We've got, particularly for first responders and firefighters, occupational cancer risk, but certainly a large component as well is lifestyle and other, I call it off the fireground risks that Dr. Smith will walk us through. But I want to just set the stage on the magnitude of cancer in the United States. So general population, typically close to 40% of both male and women combined at some point in their lifetime are going to end up battling cancer. So this is a large prevalence disease that affects the United States population as a whole. Let's take a look at the impact on the fire service as well. This is actually the NIOSH study, the largest study that's been done. I call it the Mac Daddy of fire service cancer studies. Looked at 30-some-odd thousand firefighters in Philadelphia, Chicago, and San Francisco. In the totality of the data was that firefighters, in addition to that general population risk, have a 9% higher rate of contracting cancer than general population or other occupations, and unfortunately a 14% higher mortality rate from cancers than from other professions or general population. So it's an elevated risk driven by carcinogenic exposure, which we'll touch on shortly, as well as lifestyle factors as well that Dr. Smith will talk about. And we see a high prevalence in the fire service of some perhaps not so healthy lifestyle factors. So the exposure portion of this is what I call toxic soup. We know that firefighters are exposed to products of combustion by the work they do. And the off-gassing of those products, in many cases, are linked to carcinogen-laden products that actually have been shown to be cancer-causing. I just put there's about 10 or 12 on this screen. There's literally hundreds of products of combustion that firefighters are exposed to. Some of them we know about, other ones we're still evolving, so it's a challenge. How the absorption occurs, that's a huge factor, predominantly twofold. One is through the respiratory system, if we're not always on protective air and facial protection. But also our protective gear was largely developed for thermal protection, for heat. But some research that's been done in the last several years has identified, you can see the radio opaque images on the right side of these pictures. Those were from after exposure to toxic environments in firefighting gear. We see that the carcinogens actually penetrate through the gear, and actually, as we're doing work in 600, 700, 800-degree environments, and our skin pores are vastly dilated compared to normal, that absorption is just going through the skin and circulated into the lymphatic and circulatory system. So work is being done to provide barrier devices that will still get thermal protection, but also carcinogen protection. Some research is also underway. This is one wearable device. There's others out there that are able to monitor and track the levels of carcinogen exposure that firefighters have had, both short-term and over time. So our knowledge in this is vastly increasing. Next slide. So some of the takeaways, and I'm sure Dr. Smith is going to cover some of the things we need to be thinking about and doing lifestyle-wise on the carcinogen exposure. A real just driving home takeaway point is the need to decontaminate as rapidly as possible. So mitigation practices, and then post-exposure decontamination. This is just one example of a gross decontamination spray. Additionally, there's wipes that can remove carcinogens from the skin, keeping in mind the skin's the largest organ in the body. So the quicker we can get that exposure off of us, the less that's going to be absorbed into our circulatory system and target organs. I'd be remiss for a couple reasons. One is LifeScan Wellness is built on the foundation of providing public safety, firefighters, law enforcement with comprehensive early detection physicals, and why that's so important on the cancer front, whether it's from an occupational cancer that you've developed, or whether it's from a lifestyle or genetic predisposition that we're going to touch on. This is just one example of 4 common types of cancers, both in general public and in firefighters: colon, prostate, breast, and bowel. And you think when you hear the word cancer, it's a death sentence. But if you look at the left side of the slide, in almost every case, if it's identified within the precancerous cell stage or in the primary site of origin of that cancer, survival rates are just tremendous. 5-year survivals are high 90s to close to 100% in almost every case. On the right side of the screen, if that cancer spreads beyond the primary site, and that's important because oftentimes when you first have symptoms, it may already have spread. So early detection is key, but if it spreads beyond the primary site, you can see the survival rates just precipitously drop off a cliff almost, and in many cases get down to single-digit 5-year survival. So for all population, early detection exams are crucial. For firefighters, because of that elevated occupational risk plus the lifestyle risk, an annual early detection physical is paramount to survival and early detection. Just an example of our great teams that work throughout the United States. We're tremendously proud to have a partnership with StrongPath, and our teams work to provide not only early detection, but assessment of physical wellness and fitness, and great partnership with LifeScan and StrongPath. And shout out to all of our teams out there that are doing great work. And I'm going to keep us on track time-wise, hopefully hand this back over to Dr. Smith, and we'll continue to work through today's presentation.
Thanks so much, Chief. That was great information. And what we do at StrongPath and why I think it's a great complement to your work at LifeScan is we're going to look at lifestyle strategies that can be implemented alongside the detection, which is critical, as well as the procedures that are recommended for firefighters specifically in a way that they can do their job, and after each call, how they're able to clean their suits and the things that they need to do necessarily to reduce their risk. So it's a very complementary relationship that we have. And I'm going to start off just talking about, well, this slide actually dovetails very well with one of your slides, about the life expectancy in a patient who's been diagnosed with prostate cancer relatively young, let's say in their 50s or early 60s. Their life expectancy is actually longer than that of the average male. It's interesting, right? So being diagnosed with prostate cancer at an early stage when you're relatively young, you tend to have a longer life expectancy than the average male. Why is that? It's because it's a wake-up call. The idea that you've been diagnosed with cancer causes people to really want to motivate a change in their lifestyle. And it really goes to show the importance of lifestyle in prevention of cancer and just overall reducing mortality risk. So what I'm going to do is take you through a general etiology of the disease, different things that cause cancer, and then how lifestyle plays a role in each one of those. And I'll share a couple interesting studies just superficially with you that I think that you'll find intriguing. One of the first things that we mention when we think of risk of cancer is chronic low-grade inflammation, which is commonplace among all chronic diseases and very commonplace among people that are inactive with visceral obesity, metabolic kind of centralized obesity. And it activates some cancer genes, one of which is the NF-kappa B, which literally increases the proliferation rate of cancer cells and has the cancer cells more adapt in a way that prolongs their survival, which we obviously don't want, and it accelerates their growth. You know, all of us have cancer cells in us, and what we're hoping is that those cells either self-destruct or that different defense mechanisms in our body seek them out and destroy them. But inflammation gives those cancer cells a fighting chance at proliferating and dividing and eventually metastasizing. And NF-kappa B is one of those genes that happens to do that. So trying to live a lifestyle that's going to reduce inflammation is critical. Think about it as you go weight train, your muscles get inflamed, and that inflammation is necessary for your muscles to grow. Well, inflammation also drives the growth of cancer cells. So what is it that we can do to reduce chronic low-grade inflammation? Well, every bout of exercise is like a shot of cortisone. Think of it as like a cortisol shot. It improves the specificity of our immune system and lowers our overall inflammation on every single bout. Not necessarily in the muscles you're using. You might get some localized inflammation in the muscles that you just damaged during a heavy weight training bout, for example, but systemically your inflammation is reduced, and it's because of the release of several different types of muscle hormones that go into circulation and drive down inflammation in a way that can help protect us from the damaging effects of inflammation, including the growth of cancer cells. Also, the indirect effects of weight loss, maintaining a healthy body weight. As fat cells shrink, they release something called adiponectin, which is anti-inflammatory and has antioxidant properties, as well as the loss of that visceral fat, that hidden deep fat that becomes rancid. It actually gets oxidized back there. When it gets oxidized, it accumulates immune cells that release cytokines and increase our systemic inflammation. So through exercise, keeping a healthy body weight and exercising on a regular basis, it's like a daily dose of anti-inflammatory medicine. Now, when you combine exercise with diet, which is something that our coaches are trained to do with our clients, is that we look at a number of phytochemicals. I mean, there's thousands of phytochemicals, plant-based chemicals that have been shown to have antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects, antioxidant effects, excuse me. And many phytochemicals exist that we believe haven't even been identified yet, because when you increase whole plant foods in your diet, the health benefits are beyond what can be predicted through various modeling, looking at risk factors and nutrients and their benefits. So there's numerous phytochemicals, again, many of which probably haven't even been identified, that lower inflammation, lower blood pressure, reduce blood clotting, and have antioxidant effects. And you can see a list of some of them here. But every day, instead of taking like a multivitamin, if you think of getting your green leafy vegetables, getting your brassicas, which is like your broccoli and onion group, getting your broccoli and cabbage group, alliums, which are like the onion and garlic family, bright red colored vegetables high in polyphenols and antioxidants, and purple and blue plants. All these have beneficial nutrients that can lower inflammation in the body. and help protect in that way. They actually, one of the things our coaches will use is an app to assess your health and check it on an ongoing basis. And we look at things like antioxidant index and inflammatory index, and we base it on the types of food compounds you have in your diet. And here's a list of COX-2 inhibitors. Many of you probably know that COX-2 inhibition is the way NSAIDs work as anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen and aspirin. Well, the carotenoids, curcumin, turmeric, resveratrol, green tea extract, which is the epigallocatechin gallate, genistein from soy, and then omega-3 fatty acids from like seeds, like flaxseed, or from grass-fed meats or fresh fish. All of those have COX-2 inhibition elements to them to lower inflammation that we can just include every day in our diet along with exercise. Another one that's interesting, and this is a study that I'll just allude to, is the research that's come out on this new GC compound that exists in animals but not in humans. So the only way humans have it in their body is by eating excessive amounts of animal protein, and especially from quadrupeds, not so much poultry and fish, but from quadrupeds. So this new GC is a type of glycoprotein that looks very similar to one we have on the membranes of our cells, but it's not human. So it actually presents itself as an antigen, and for some reason it really has a high affinity for cancer cells in our body. So those cancer cells that exist in our body will accumulate this new GC antigen, if you will, on the surface of the membrane of the cell. And that drives localized inflammation because the body recognizes it as foreign. And now in an environment of inflammation, cancer cells rapidly proliferate. So this may be one of the links between an excessive high red meat diet and increased risk of cancer. So reducing red meat and focusing on quality whole plant foods, in addition to quality meats, so some grass-fed meats and some fish and some healthy white meat, is really a generally recommended diet for cancer prevention. Getting outside and moving also helps lower our inflammation because it improves, it has an immunomodulatory effect, getting adequate amounts of vitamin D. When I teach vitamin D to graduate students in nutrition, I don't teach it as a vitamin, I actually teach it as a hormone. If you look from just 20 minutes of being outside, you get 4,000 international units of vitamin D as opposed to one whole egg where you only get 40 international units. I mean, it really is a hormone activated by the sun, and it improves immune surveillance. It improves the ability for immune cells to determine targets and attack pathogens and improperly growing cells in our body, such as cancer cells. Now, another thing that we know with cancer is that cancer cells thrive on glucose. They have to rely on anaerobic fuel, glycolysis, and a high sugar diet, a high processed food diet will obviously increase the ability for these cells to have glucose made available, as well as insulin resistance, where we have trouble putting glucose in our normal cells. So the glucose levels in our blood rise, and now cancer cells have more fuel to grow. So cancer cells thrive on glucose. And there are various dietary strategies, obviously a kind of Eco-Atkins style ketogenic diet, or other strategies to teach your central nervous system to use metabolites of fat called ketones. So this is a study that just came out in April of this year, and they looked at fasting by, it's kind of a unique way of doing it, fasting at, from dawn until sunset. I'm sorry, fasting from dawn until sunset. So they'd have breakfast and they'd have dinner, but then fast the rest of the time. And they found a significant uptick in the anti-cancer proteins that are in the plasma, as well as other mechanisms that may help fight cancer. So ketogenic diets, intermittent fasting, training the body to rely more on fat as a fuel source, which is what these strategies do, would be an important element of an anti-cancer lifestyle strategy, as well as its effects on improving glucose sensitivity, lowering insulin levels, and helping keep a healthy body weight. Another thing that you'll find in the literature is how cancer cells, they grow rapidly in response to growth factors that are in the body, endocrine growth factors. So we find that especially this insulin-like growth factor, most people are aware of growth hormone, but growth hormone only has about a 20-minute half-life, and it binds to the liver, and it promotes the release of these growth factors called, one of the main ones, IGF-1, that has a 20-hour half-life. And so it has a systemic effect on growth on everything. And obviously during throughout adolescence and regular growth, we want high levels of IGF-1. But when we're adults, an IGF-1, if it doesn't have a place to go, it's going to accelerate cell replication and proliferation of cancer cells. So we find that IGF-1 is linked significantly to increased cancer risk. For example, women that are a little taller in stature have a higher risk of breast cancer. When we look at the consumption of bovine proteins, especially dairy, we see high levels of IGF-1. And take a moment to pause and think about, what is dairy made for specifically? It's made for the growth of animals. So it's not surprising that the proteins associated with dairy would drive up circulating IGF-1 levels. And we can see the consumption of these bovine proteins, especially again, whey and casein proteins from dairy, we see a significant increase in the association with different types of cancer-related deaths throughout the world. Now, here's a theorized relationship. This is the fun part, between weight training and a potential for protection against cancer. You know, when you weight train, your muscles break down and there are various amino acids that go in the circulation, and those amino acids go into your brain. They basically tell the brain, hey, we're damaged. You know, we need to fix this. And the brain, in response to that, will release growth hormone, which then binds to the liver and releases IGF-1. And now the IGF-1 has something for it to do. It's going to go repair those damaged muscles. That's perfect within a homeostatic feedback loop that makes a lot of sense. Now let's take someone who's inactive, couch potato, eating a high meat diet. Well, those flesh foods have similar amino acids as what would be released after a bout of weight training. The difference is that we didn't weight train in this case. Now we have these same circulating amino acids that go to the brain, release growth hormone, cause the rise in IGF-1. So it really shouldn't be a surprise that now this IGF-1 doesn't really have a place to act. It may be more likely to act on our existing cancer cells. When we look at a study, and I'll be very quick with this study, this one's fascinating, where it was just 14 days of women that were perimenopausal, high risk of breast cancer because they were inactive. They did not have breast cancer, but they were inactive and they had poor diets. And they were at a very high risk of breast cancer. And what they did is they purchased cancer cell lines. Here are 3 different cancer cell lines for their lab. And they would take the blood of these women and drip it on these cancer cells in vitro. And on the left, what you'd look at is the rate of those cells growing. And the dark bar is pre, and the post bar is post a 14-day increased exercise and plant-based nutrition intervention. So in 14 days, you can see that every one of those cancer cell lines decreased significantly in the rate of growth. And in the rate of death, which is apoptosis on the right, figure 2, you can see in just 14 days of eating a plant-based diet and just walking, they had significant increases. When they dropped the blood of the women after 14 days on those cells, you can see significant increases in the rate at which those cancer cells died. It was almost as if they had cancer-proofed their blood in a sense in as little as 14 days. The main factor, this is another way of looking at the same data, but the main factor they found was that it was changing the levels of IGF-1 that lifestyle did to make a difference. Because when they added the IGF-1 growth factor back into the serum, the benefits of diet and exercise were essentially erased. So you can see the growth pattern come back up again, and you can see the cell death pattern go back down again. So it seemed that one of the major mechanisms through lifestyle change that helped prevent the growth of these cancers, of these cancer cells, were changes in IGF-1. Along those lines, there's a type of dwarfism, Laron Dwarfism, where they're born with a mutation where they cannot produce IGF-1. None of these dwarfs that are found in remote regions of Ecuador, none of them, despite I believe there's over 1,000 that have this type of dwarfism, have ever developed cancer. So we do think IGF-1 is a major cancer, and through lifestyle change, especially weight training and the avoidance of excessive amounts of dairy and red meat, we would expect perhaps to reduce that risk. Another thing that is very important with cancer prevention is preventing cancer cells from growing blood vessels. You know, there's a great talk that I would refer you to, a TED talk by William Lee on eating to starve cancer. And in this talk, he describes how cancer cells that are in our body, if they don't have blood vessels, they're essentially harmless. They're not going to grow to a point where they're going to develop into a tumor, and they're not going to spawn babies into our circulation and metastasize. So cancer cells become deadly once they generate blood vessels. And we call that angiogenesis. So diet and exercise can significantly reduce angiogenic factors. It can help prune these blood vessels back on these cancer cells and prevent them from getting the blood flow and the nourishment that they need to grow. In fact, here's a list from Dr. Lee's research on how various foods that you can find in your kitchen cabinet various phytochemicals and things stack up against actual anti-cancer, anti-angiogenic drugs. And you can see down there, the shorter the bar, the more effective, but you can see berries and parsley and artichoke and soy and garlic have significant anti-angiogenic effects as they stack right up there with the anti-cancer drugs. Coming down the home stretch here with lifestyle, because I know I don't want to take up too much of your time, but we have a guardian angel gene. So it's a good way to kind of leave today and knowing that you have a guardian angel. It's P53 is one of those tumor suppressor genes that exists in our cells, kind of proofreads the DNA of our cells. And if our cells aren't growing properly, P53 will either fix the improper growth or cause the cell to self-destruct. Dietary nutrients and exercise can upregulate the expression of this guardian angel gene. So in other words, in a person who eats a healthy diet, high in whole food-based nutrition, as well as exercising regularly, will have a higher expression of this P53 gene to help prevent things that cause cancer cells to grow. This is a study that came out recently on P53 and tumor suppression in response to exercise. And it seems whenever the glycogen levels in a muscle cell are lower, as well as an increase in muscle contraction and calcium release and mechanical stress in the muscle, we see an elevation in the P53 guardian angel gene. So you can get glycogen levels down either through fasting, by eating a relatively low carb diet, by exercise, or by doing all of the above. And you can get a higher expression of your guardian angel gene. So to summarize, in exercise-associated cancer prevention lifestyle, we see improved blood flow to the healthy areas of the body and less to those cancer cells. Reduce chronic inflammation, ventilation throughout the tracheobronchial tree to activate our innate immune system, reducing oxidative stress, improving the ability for immune cells to detect pathogens and destroy them. The endocrine responses are favorable to cancer prevention, maintaining a healthy body weight, reducing fecal transit time to reduce cancer, colon cancer, and then increasing P53 for better DNA repair mechanisms. With diet, avoiding excessive caloric intake, maintaining a healthy body weight, getting an inundation of whole vegetables each day and fruits, avoiding refined carbohydrates and simple sugars, getting adequate amounts of soluble fiber like in fact flaxseed, beans, oats, and nuts, low intake of conventional red meat and dairy, adequate omega-3s, B12, and folate. And by the way, getting outside is important too. And the way in which these work is, like, just to recap, is to reduce the growth rate of these precancerous cells, inducing cell death in some of these cells, lowering inflammation, lowering blood vessel development, and promoting the normal differentiation of cells. So I think that about covers what I had to say today. I appreciate you being here. And before we go, I just wanted to show you what we have on the StrongPath app along these lines. So when we give patients recommendations, we have specific functional foods that we include that fight cancer, exercise programs and recommendations, monitoring of the people that are on our platform, so that our coaching can be specific to helping you reach your healthiest destination along the StrongPath. Thank you, and appreciate you taking time to be with us today. Happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you, Dr. Smith. We're now open for a quick Q&A. We have a couple of questions for Dr. Smith. One of them is, what are your thoughts on organic versus conventional produce and meat? And do you have any concerns regarding pesticide residues such as glyphosate?
Yeah, so those are some good questions. I'll start with when you think about meats, grass-fed meats versus what are really called pasture-raised versus conventional meat, you look at the compounds that are actually in the meat. You know, years ago, I'd say 2 decades ago, right, turn of the century, we didn't really think there was a big difference. When someone said, oh, this is grass-fed meat, we just thought, oh, you know, it's more expensive, it may not have any real health benefits. But when you look at the compounds within the meat, you see there's a lot more omega-3s. There's a lot of different types of saturated fats. So instead of palmitic acid, which we know promotes inflammation and is bad for your cholesterol level, there's higher levels of the saturated fat called stearic acid. So it's actually a different lipid composition. You also have conjugated linoleic acid, which has been shown to be anti-carcinogenic and anti-inflammatory, and the list goes on and on. Much higher levels of vitamin A, vitamin E. So it does matter, this term quality meat. Some of my vegan friends would say that that's that's not a possible term, that it's an oxymoron. But quality meat would be these meats from animals that are foraging and eating off the land the way they that really we've evolved eating those types of animals. So I think that there is a difference there. Now, when you talk about organic versus conventional grown vegetables, you really want to look at, it's easy to find on the web even some of the evidence-based suggestions for the dirty dozen. The vegetables that are the ones in fruits that you most want to get organic because of the cross-sectional area on those fruits and vegetables. Like strawberries are very high in the pesticide residue that exists in conventional berries and strawberries than you would find in organic. So those are I point people in direction of looking at that. I mean, in some cases, like with bananas and with artichokes and with avocado, there where what you're consuming is mainly inside the vegetable, being organic versus being conventional isn't as big a deal. And with regard to the Roundup spray that you were mentioning in the glyphosate that exists, we see high correlations in things like celiac disease, intestinal related other nutrient sensitivities and like leaky gut and other intestinal issues with grain consumption and the use of Roundup and some other types of pesticides in the crops. But those are correlations. They're very, very strong correlations. They are worrisome, but they're not causal, those studies. So at this point, what we have to say is that we have to just try to, when you consume foods that are not organic, you want to try to consume those only in moderation and not in excess. And they're generally recognized as safe, is a statement that the USDA puts out about them. GRAS, generally recognized as safe. So we need to do more research in that area on glyphosate, which I can't pronounce, but it's Roundup basically.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And pertaining to that topic, do you think that changing the quality of the meat is more important than reducing its overall consumption?
I think you aim to do both. So I really do. And it's splitting hairs if someone has a really bad processed diet. Like I would say that one of the worst diets you can be on is a vegan diet where, and if that's just a soundbite that doesn't come out well, but a vegan diet where people are eating a highly processed, full of refined sugar-based type of diet. So you can have, you can eat Skittles and French fries all day and be vegan. That's one of the most unhealthy diets. But a plant-based diet full of whole foods and you eat in a way where it's like vegetables with a side of meat, that's a much healthier type of diet. So limiting how much meat you consume, increasing the vegetable content of what you eat on a regular basis, the plant-based content of what you eat on a regular basis, and then getting the more quality meats is really the main aim that we drive for.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions. You mentioned IGF-1 being a contributor factor in cancer. Can supplements often used for muscle growth, like whey protein and casein, increase the cancer risk?
Again, you look at these are associative studies. So we look at the association between some of these bovine proteins and higher IGF-1 and then higher risk of cancer. So we're kind of connecting dots there. We really can't say there's a causal relationship. But again, it makes sense sort of physiologically as well, that there is a higher risk. But the point of the slides that I showed really were to show to display the beneficial effects of weight training. So if someone's using or consuming these proteins in their weight training and exercising with it, then presumably the IGF-1 is going to be used to help repair muscle tissue, which is something that we want to see. It's in people who are sedentary with these high meat-based diet with lots of dairy proteins and lots of red meat that don't do any activity. They'd be the ones I think should worry. But IGF-1 is really critical to the repair and growth hormone, to the repair and preservation of skeletal muscle, especially in active people. So if you're consuming whey protein, which is actually the protein I recommend as a sports protein in a recovery meal, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think that since you're exercising, there wouldn't be the same need to worry.
Great, thank you. And one more question. You mentioned that berries can be beneficial and anti-cancerous, but are other fruits and the sugars from fruits can they contribute to cancer?
That's a great question, and I should have brought it up. So I'm really appreciative that person asked the question. So there's a difference between extrinsic sugar and intrinsic sugar. Extrinsic sugar is sugar that has been removed from a plant, been extracted, and no longer is attached to the cell wall of the plant with the fiber there. If you think about where through evolution would we have gotten just straight sugar, especially fructose, which is one of the monosaccharides in sugar with glucose, where would we ever have been able to consume it without fiber? And it's impossible. You can't find that. So every single time throughout evolution where we've consumed sugar, it's been attached to the cell wall of the plant. It's had fiber attached to it. And that fiber does a lot to mitigate how much we absorb. It also does a lot to promote the health of our microbiota in our gut, to also help us in the way in which we are absorbing the sugar from a plant. So intrinsic sugar that's naturally found in fruits and vegetables doesn't seem to have really any association with disease. What you have is people reading food labels and saying, wow, these grapes are real high in sugar. But the reality is that a lot of that sugar, the absorption of it will be mitigated because of the fiber, and the benefits of consuming grapes far outweigh the sugar levels within the grapes. It's really processed carbohydrates where the sugar has been extracted. That's the sugar that we're worried about. Also, juice is included in it as well. So like eating an orange is far healthier than eating or drinking orange juice.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. And that is the last question. So with that, we will be concluding our anti-cancer lifestyle webinar. Thank you very much for your attendance. And please make sure to check out StrongPath and LifeScan and how we can help you on your path to a cancer-free lifestyle. Thank you.
Thanks.